Hey folks, we are about a minute out from official start time at 6 o'clock, but since there's always some little technical issue, I decided to hit the go live button early and it looks like it went without a hitch this time, so go figure. I'm your host for the Penn Yan Action Coaltion ongoing digital community reads. I'm Alex. Hope to have folks back who have visited with us online or in person before as we continued our discussion of Francisco Cantu's The Line Becomes a River. I got lots of input from folks who are reading at home today on this section, on this theme of section 2, which is the culture of violence. So I have lots of material to share with the viewing audience. And again, remember, if you're watching at home and you've been following along with the book and you have thoughts on this theme in particular, but any other thoughts too, if you wish, write us some comments. Let us know what you think, okay? And I hear from the sound of church bells that it is 6 o'clock now. Isn't that nice? I just recently moved and now we're right next to a church and we can never mistake what time it is, which is good. Okay. So I'll go ahead and get started. And if folks out there are still joining us, you missed the beginning of this, you can always watch it after the fact. Facebook saves these videos and allows you to go back and watch them at your leisure, add more comments, all that stuff. So we are getting into the theme, the culture of violence. And once again, thank you to Claudia, one of the members of the Penn Yan Action Coalition planning team, for coming up with these themes. So Claudia writes, violence is a recurring theme in part 2 of The Line Becomes a River. Staring into a workstation monitor at a prairie falcon, the author says, quote, I took several steps toward the screen as if to reach the bird. I'm afraid to come any closer. I wanted to whisper. I'm afraid the violence will no longer shake me. That's on page 112. Another passage, well, I'll give you a second. I'm trying to remember to give things time to breathe. So I'll reread that one, in fact. I took several steps toward the screen as if to reach the bird. I'm afraid to come any closer. I wanted to whisper. I'm afraid the violence will no longer shake me. Another passage that Claudia has pointed out for us is on page 147. Quote, in their ongoing attempts to understand the roots of human violence, scientists have identified a genetic deficiency that predisposes certain men to acts of hostility. Oh, that was on page 146, actually. I'm sorry. It continues on to page 147. This gene is identified as a, quote, warrior gene. Cantu goes on to say that subsequent studies have shown that, quote, about 1/3 of the world's male population carry the gene, the expression of which can be triggered by childhood exposure to trauma. It's talking about the warrior gene that predisposes certain men to acts of hostility, that 1/3 of the world's male population carry the gene. Looking at the annals of history, that is not too hard to believe. Claudia also has given us a passage from page 159. In yet another nightmare, the author cites a violent train of events, ending with, I look at the scene before me and am gripped with profound panic. A crushing darkness washes over everything, and I throw my gun to the ground, terrified that I have become forever looped in a crippling exchange of violence. So, not surprising that a book of this theme would deal with the culture of violence, the cycles of violence. Oh, John is telling me he can see but not hear me. Can you still see but not hear me? a sec. Can you hear me now? My audio is reading good on my end, so perhaps it's an issue on the listener's end, but please do chime in. Are people able to hear me? Hey, let me check with my lovely assistant. Hey, Ronnie. Ronnie, was that me you were hearing? So my audio is coming through? Okay, yeah, my audio is coming through for other users. So, John, I'd say check your audio settings. Sorry?
Are you yelling at me on Facebook Live?
Please hold. People were saying they couldn't hear me, so I was checking that you could hear me. My lovely assistant, Ronald. The joys of working from home, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, hopefully everyone else can hear me. John, I hope you can hear me. Check your volume controls. Sometimes Facebook videos default to muted when you. Oh, now he's got me playing in the background, and that's really distracting. Sometimes Facebook videos default to muted when you first encounter them. So if you hover over the video of me, you might see the little audio icon with the X through it. So just try clicking on that. But hopefully everybody else, if there's anyone else out there watching me, you are able to hear me. Okay, so those were the passages and concepts that Claudia had pointed out for us, and I did receive a number of comments and things from various members of the community. Nancy, another member of the Penn Yan Action Coalition planning organization, wrote to me, referring to pages 146 and 147. She says, I found these passages to be very interesting. I had never heard of the study about the violence gene, and it is telling. It helps explain how culture and society become violent, accept violence, and justify violence. Possibly as violence increased in our society or culture, it allowed more militarization at the border. This in turn could have led to the culture of violence by border patrol. It was also interesting that it was men that had the gene. Did women not have the gene? Good question. Let me see here. All right, sorry, just your audio settings, if you can. Audio seems to be working for others. Okay, sorry. Okay. So yes, that's a good question. Do women possess the violence gene? I think this has been an eternal question. You know, if we were ruled by matriarchies, would we live in a world of peace and togetherness? And I think it's too simple to say yes or no. There have certainly been plenty of female rulers and heads of state who, driven by the forces of current events and politics and all that stuff, have proven just as violent as men have been in power. And there are certainly some women who have ruled and led and governed much more wisely. So I think that is it would be interesting if we knew whether that study included women, to see if women carry that gene or not. Another member of the Penn Yan Action Coalition, Peggy, wrote about her experience in the world of adopting children, and about the traumatic experience that make it impossible for them to trust enough to fit into a family, she says. She remarked that one of the concerns for adopting families is keeping the family safe. Children who are adopted from an orphanage often act out. And at times, Peggy writes, for the safety of the family, children must be placed in separate situations, institutional situations, group homes, in order to preserve the peace and safety of the family. But she says families did not want to give up. We would say, do not surrender. Do not surrender. But putting the kids in a temporary, putting them aside while they work through some of those issues can help keep those at home safe. But in her experience, there have been positive outcomes as children grow up. Sometimes that when they've been taken out of the culture of violence that maybe they were born into, their outcomes are a lot better. She writes that one child who was adopted at an older age from foster care had a lot of problems. There were some violent tendencies, some threatening actions. But today that child is a loving adult parenting his own children. His adoptive parents never gave up, though he could not always live at home. So that's a hopeful take on the culture of violence. If folks can be removed from that, there is hope for them to, for peaceful resolution to come to their life. And I suppose I could leave it to those of you listening at home to think about how that might apply to the situation at the border with the Border Patrol. Would an easing of the tensions and a serious reduction in the incidence of violence in that quarter result in better outcomes for everyone, the Border Patrol themselves, Border Patrol agents, and for the immigrants that they are in contact with? All right, we have some more thoughts from another Penn Yan Action Coalition member, Scarlett. She remarked upon page 105, and she mentioned this is the second time she's reading through part 2, and that she reacted much the same way as on her first reading, that it's beautifully written but troubling. It sounds to be about the case. She remarked upon page 89, Cantu writes, "So it becomes a war against the people. This was written about the deciphering the language of drug war killings, which are meant to send a message." And she wonders, what is the message of violence? Fear, control, hopelessness. I see Claudia is chiming in the comments. Hello, Claudia. Glad you could be with us. Yes, responding to some of Peggy's comments about the reversal of the cycle of violence for some. And so back to Scarlett's comments about the message of violence. I think that's a really good question. Violence is a kind of language itself, and it is trying to send a message, but what is it? And this seems to be in reference to the violence that can be found on the other side of the border that the migrant peoples are fleeing from. And that's very important to take into account. Then they come to our border, and there's different kinds of violence that they run into here. And what message is that violence sending? Certainly seems like control, certainly seems, as we know from the stated policies of the current administration, we don't want to be seen as a comfortable final destination in some cases. That self deportation message that they get. Scarlett remarks upon page 105 about the cycles of war. Do we become so used to war and violence that we almost don't notice the individual casualties? That certainly goes back to the discussion we were having the other day about identity and how it is easy for individual humanity to get lost in the statistics of terrible events, things like the Holocaust, things like 9/11, things like the Vietnam War, and things like what we're dealing with at the border. And I think that just, the cycle of violence and the question of the importance of identity certainly do connect that way. Take a second just in case anybody's typing any thoughts out there. I see Claudia has remarked, are people seeking control in a world where they have little control? Good thought, absolutely. Let's see, I'll just read ahead here a little bit while people are thinking about these heavy topics. So she remarks on page 107, Scarlett still, quote, "The number of deaths does little to account for all the ways that violence rips and ripples through a society, through the lives and minds of its inhabitants," end quote. And she adds, contributes to an insensitivity to the actual horror of the actual victims, and ultimately our insensitivity to the violence itself. As it says on page 138, they think it's natural. And Scarlett says, "What a horrible way to live, I say." And yeah, this is tragic. A passage from page 128 and 129. Cantu writes of his visit to his uncle, speaking to a wider and more inclusive effect of violence. "My mind had become so filled with violence that I could barely perceive beauty in the landscape around me." How sad is that? And one hopes that, as we were saying earlier, maybe there's hope for those kinds of things to be reversed if you can remove yourself from the cycles of violence. Perhaps you will then be able to perceive beauty again. And one wonders how universal are these experiences Cantu is describing. This is obviously through his perspective. These are experiences and reactions he had. Are these reactions generalizable to other Border Patrol agents? Are they generalizable to people experiencing violence as they flee their homelands? Perhaps not, but it certainly seems, whether or not everyone has the same words for these effects that Cantu uses, it's hard to imagine that people are not similarly affected in some way. And then Scarlett finishes off her observations. She says, "The loop of violence touches all of us. Cantu's last dream in this part brings that home to us. His reaction to that dream is to want to make peace with the wolf," bringing us back to the imagery of the wolf from our first Facebook Live event. "Would that the world could identify the wolf and make peace with it." Yeah. We know there are wolves. We know they're out there. And I think Scarlett hits the nail on the head that if it were easy to identify and satisfy the needs of the wolf, whatever that stands for from each person's point of view, the world might be an easier place to live in. So thank you for all those thoughts, Scarlett. I received some thoughts from Mickey and Ed. Again, folks who are heavily involved in the Penn Yan Action Coalition. They ask, and this is good. I didn't plan it this way, but this lines up nicely with Scarlett's final thought. They ask how or what actions will feed the wolf, and that's the big question that we're left with. They resume, if we're talking about migration, they say, I think it's legal reform, but violence in the broader world, yes, we can work on it face to face if we're brave enough to confront it when it happens, physically or verbally. But other than being sure those in power, elected officials, are of like mind, how? And Ed and Mickey remark, our book club last night was mightily focused on a feeling of what can we do. The book touched us all, but left us all with the question of what actions we can or should take to change this. And that is certainly, I don't know. That's the fact that it's making us have these thoughts is a good first step. But then what actions can we take? What can feed the wolf? And I think they bring up a good point. We have to make sure those in power are aware. And we've got to keep pushing the line towards humanity. Inhumane policies lead to inhumane outcomes. And that's true. No matter the political party, no matter who's in power, every regime could do better on that score. and it's up to the voters and the people to demand it. Let's see here. Okay, we have thoughts from Cindy, another one of our organizers. Let's see. She's referring to page 93, a statement by ICE. The alien becomes a commodity. One way you raise the value of the commodity, of that commodity, is by threatening and terrorizing someone. And I think in response to that, she writes, how about a culture of harmony, of generosity, of appreciation, of compromise, of love, of forgiveness? And then she remarks, because there's the control factor in a culture of violence. There is money to be made in a culture of violence. That's a great point, a sobering point. That's true. We're putting people in for-profit facilities in some cases. I don't know the details of a lot of that, but certainly we've all heard the stories over the past couple of years as places reach capacity and people who've been taken at the border are farmed out to other facilities, which are certainly in that prison profit pipeline, triple P. That's from my buddy Mike, who just commented. But I think Cindy is so right to note that, unfortunately, we haven't figured out a way to profit from harmony and generosity and appreciation and compromise and love. And that's really depressing. And so as long as there is money to be made in a culture of violence that includes dominating people, that includes locking them away, that includes traumatizing them, then it's going to be really hard to break that cycle. Cindy continues, Cantu cannot by himself change the culture of violence. He can write a memoir, Dispatches from the Border, a book that can be read by many people, plant seeds in many people's minds, encourage conversations about this topic. Recently, Cindy says, I heard someone say, quote, policy cannot be changed until there are conversations about the topic. Very true. So Cantu's work and our work reading it and discussing it is all part of the necessary process that is slow and frustrating. And so, progress seems so tantalizingly close and so frustratingly far away. But the discussions are an important place to start. Cindy continues. She's referring to the coyotes, the folks who help transport immigrants across the border. The coyotes are only thinking about numbers and money, not individuals. When immigrants cannot keep up with the others, they may be left behind. To what fate? And she wonders if that's part of the identity conversation. That's true. It's fair to say that the profit motive is not one-sided. It's not just the American prison industry that is seeking to profit from this situation. Let's see. Page 96, she remarks, in cities like Tijuana and Juarez, the cycle of violence was so tightly looped, so unending that cartel members often raided morgues, reclaiming the bodies of victims, comrades, and leaders. The bodies were ferried from one death-ridden place to another, hovering indefinitely above ground, endlessly lying in wait for a place to rest in the earth. Wow. And Cindy comments, another example of the cycle of violence being so tightly looped. In some of the Central American countries, the threats and bribery and violence give people only one choice: to flee, often fleeing into the arms of more violence. And Cindy is always grateful. She's always making sure to let us know that she is grateful, and she ends her thoughts, grateful for everyone's thinking. We're grateful for your thinking, Cindy. Thank you. And then I have some thoughts from Claudia, who I know is on the line with us here today, sharing some thoughts in the moment. But if you don't mind, Claudia, I'll read what you sent me earlier today. So returning to the idea of the warrior gene, she's intrigued by that possibility. The study was done on men, but do we all have the capacity for violence unless it's restrained in some way by society, religious upbringing, etc.? Great question, chilling question. I think we like to think that some of us are above the need and the push for violence, but maybe it's something we've all gotten. We're just societally acclimated to being, to having different choices. And that's one thing. We all have, some like to say that you all have the choice to do good or to do bad, to do right or do wrong. I think we do all have choices, but some of us have different sets of choices from others. I'm listening to a pretty remarkable podcast right now called S-Town, and not to shock my listeners, but that stands for Shit Town. And it's about it's a This American Life reporter who was contacted by a man from a place called Woodstock, Alabama. And basically just to say, like, this town is messed up and I've lived here my whole life and it's terrible. And I think the cops are crooked. I think the politicians are corrupt. I think the few people who have money are able to get away with whatever they want, including this supposed murder that had taken place. Speaking of cycles of violence, apparently like a scuffle between a few, late teens, early 20s kids resulted in the supposed death of one of the kids, and it was all brushed under the rug. And this guy who contacted the reporter wanted him to come down and investigate it, try to expose what really happened and expose the underbelly of this supposedly godly little town. And that's the setup, and it kind of spins out from there, and it's really intriguing, an intriguing look at small town American life in places where there are not a lot of options. And I was just listening to an episode that delved into, you've got the one side of this whole equation of this dispute between family members of a deceased person on one end and sort of the found family of the deceased person on the other side, and they're grappling for control of the assets, as always is the case. And I just shook my head thinking, like, all these people are I almost said a bad word, but none of the people are good. None of them are heroes in this story. Whether they're the sort of the lower economic class kid who's just trying to make ends meet by sometimes not the nicest means, but had a real human connection with some of the other players in the story, nor the upper class distant relatives of the deceased person who come in from Florida. They swoop in and they try to take control of the situation. And you're first you learn to think of them as the bad guys, these carpetbaggers coming in to take over. But then things twist again, and you see they have reason to behave the way they do. And I think it's just all, the kid scrabbling to make ends meet had a certain set of choices and a certain set of tools, and some of them involved not so pleasant actions. And the upper class relatives had a set of choices and a set of tools, and neither of them can think beyond the choices that they seem to be born into. So I'm sorry, that's a digression, but it seems somewhat connected to this notion. Yeah, we've all got choices, but do we really? Okay, sorry. Back to Claudia. Another thought. I know that movies have become more and more violent over the years as we become inured to violence. I look at old movies and the violence or horror doesn't bother me like it used to. Has anyone else experienced this? Good question. I know we've got movie expert Mike Reif on the line. I don't know if he has any thoughts about society's changing perception of film violence. I'll give him a chance to think about that. Maybe he'll bless us with some thoughts later on. And third, Claudia continues, I remember reading a long time ago about how SS men were trained to become immune to human suffering. At first, they would become sick, emotionally distraught, etc., as they were forced to watch horrific things. but eventually they could eat and chat while someone is being tortured without it bothering them at all. Are there things that should bother us but don't? Another sobering thought. So we had a lot of great contributions today. I appreciate all those members of the Penn Yan Action Coalition sharing their thoughts so we can have sort of a discussion since we can't be together in a circle in a room. I hope some of you are out there watching and are thinking about this. No pressure to comment. I just hope you're thinking about these things and it's giving you different perspectives. I think I will leave it at that for now, but keep commenting. You are free to comment as long as this video is up, which as far as we know will be forever. And we are going to be back on Friday with another topic, which I do not have in front of me right now, but another of Claudia's themes. And I think we're going to have more interesting points of view from one and all. So I hope you'll join us Friday at 6 o'clock for more. And yeah, share your comments here on this video. All right. Stay safe, stay well. Good to see you all. John, I hope you were able to hear after a while. And we will all talk again soon. All right. Good night, everybody.